Under a bruised gray sky, the port town of Yokohama lay in ruins. It was September 1945. Smoke drifted between the skeletons of wooden homes, their beams blackened, their tatami mats turned to ash. In the shattered streets, silence ruled, broken only by the distant hum of a truck engine and the soft shuffle of bare feet. A group of American soldiers rolled in on jeeps, their olive uniforms still dusty from Okinawa. Children peeked from doorways, eyes wide, bellies hollow, skin drawn tight from months of hunger. The war was over, but the people had not yet learned what peace would taste like. U.S. Army Signal Corps film, Sept. 1945. The soldiers dismounted, boots crunching over broken glass. They carried no rifles raised, no bayonets gleaming, only canvas sacks marked U.S. Army rations. The Japanese onlookers froze. For years, propaganda had told them what to expect from these men, demons in uniform, killers of women and children. Mothers pulled their little ones closer, whispering prayers to ancestors for protection. Then came the moment that would haunt and heal all at once. An American private knelt down before a frail boy and offered him a tin of Spam. The boy didn't move. He thought it was a trick. The soldier smiled gently and opened the can himself, cutting a piece with his knife. The scent of salt and meat filled the air. Slowly the child reached out. Pacific War Photographic Collection, October 1945. What followed seemed impossible. The soldiers began unpacking crates of powdered milk, chocolate and hard biscuits, the same rations that had fueled them through jungles and island battles. They handed them to women, children, even old men who had once feared these hands as instruments of death. An old woman wept quietly as she received a can of fruit cocktail, bowing again and again. The soldiers nodded, awkwardly unsure how to respond to gratitude from a people they had been trained to destroy. U.S. Occupation Field Notes, Sept. 1945. Only weeks earlier, these same troops had stormed beaches under fire, watched comrades fall beside them, and seen villages burn under naval bombardment. The transformation from enemy to caretaker came with no manual. One corporal later wrote, "We didn't know what to do with our hate once the shooting stopped." Personal letter. U.S. 11th Airborne, Sept. 1945. But now, standing amid the ruins, the sight of starving children cut deeper than any wound from battle. Food, once their lifeline, became a bridge across the abyss of war. To the Japanese civilians, it was a scene that defied logic. Many believed surrender meant slavery or death. Yet here were the conquerors, sharing their most precious possession, the food that kept them alive. Rumors spread through the city like wind through broken shutters. The Americans feed their enemies. Some thought it was deception, others divine mercy. But as more people gathered, watching the same quiet generosity repeat across neighborhoods, disbelief turned to something rarer: hope. Tokyo Civilian Diaries, Sept. 1945. That afternoon, an army photographer captured a haunting image: a barefoot girl clutching a chocolate bar, staring at her reflection in the silver wrapper as if it were magic. The photograph would later appear in American newspapers, captioned "Peace begins with a meal." Yet the full story behind that image was far deeper than propaganda. For both the giver and receiver, it was a moment of transformation. Associated Press Archive, Oct. 1945. Behind the soldiers' actions was not random kindness but orders filtered down from high command. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Allied powers, had made it clear: Japan's reconstruction would not begin with guns, but with food. "A starving nation cannot learn democracy," he wrote in his directive to occupation forces. SCAP Directive No. 15, Sept. 1945. The men on the ground, many barely out of their teens, carried out this policy with a mixture of confusion and compassion. Feeding the defeated enemy felt unnatural, yet undeniably right. Rations were limited even for U.S. troops. Canned goods were measured carefully, supply ships tracked to the ounce. Yet soldiers often chose to share from their own allotments, pocketing less for themselves to give more to those around them. A sergeant from the 8th Army recalled, "The kids would line up every morning. We'd open our packs and hand out what we could. Sometimes it was a biscuit, sometimes just a smile." Oral History Interview, 1950. Every exchange carried silent meaning. The handover of a tin can became an apology without words. A shared chocolate bar was a promise that the war's cruelty would not define the peace. In the alleys of Tokyo and the villages of Honshu, Humanity resurfaced one meal at a time. Yet not all soldiers felt the same. Some couldn't bring themselves to look their former enemies in the eye. Others refused, haunted by memories of Pearl Harbor or the Bataan Death March. The tension between compassion and vengeance rippled through the occupation like an unseen fault line. War Department Psychological Report, DEC 1945. For the Japanese, hunger had been the final weapon of the war. Allied blockades had cut off supplies long before surrender. By mid-1945, millions faced starvation. Entire families survived on grass soup and barley. In that context, each American ration tin was not just food, it was salvation. Children began following patrols through the streets, shouting broken English words they had picked up. Hello? Chocolate! Soldiers, embarrassed and moved, tossed candies from trucks like confetti of peace. Occupation Troop Journal, Oct. 1945. By November, the act of sharing rations became an unofficial ritual. Soldiers in rural areas would save scraps, even coffee grounds, to give away. They began to understand what the gesture meant: control through kindness. Feeding an enemy was not weakness, it was power remade into mercy. It disarmed hatred faster than any weapon. Military Governance Memo, Nov. 1945. Still, suspicion lingered among older generations. Many whispered that the Americans must be poisoning the food, softening them for control. Yet every can, every chocolate bar told a different story. Over time, gratitude began to replace fear. Civilians who once hid behind walls now waved to passing patrols. Markets reopened under the watch of soldiers, once seen as monsters. Yokohama Reconstruction Log, DEC 1945. And as one soldier wrote home that winter, we used to think victory meant making the enemy surrender. Now I think it means feeding them until they stand on their own. Letter, Private R.J. Harlow, Jan 1946. In the ruins of a defeated empire, compassion had become the new weapon of conquest. The smell of burnt wood and the clang of tin echoed through the streets as symbols of a new era, one built not by bullets but by bread. Yet beneath this fragile peace, deeper motives and strategic calculations waited to surface, shaping how America would rebuild a nation it had destroyed. The story of mercy, it turned out, was also a story of power, and the world would soon learn just how deliberate that generosity really was. The hidden force behind those acts of mercy was neither spontaneous nor purely sentimental. It was strategy refined through logistics, policy, and psychology. Behind every can of Spam, handed to a starving child, stood a complex network of engineers, quartermasters, economists, and bureaucrats who understood one truth: hunger could be turned into allegiance. War Department Analysis Memo, 1946. In Washington, planners within the Army's Quartermaster Corps had foreseen the humanitarian crisis months before Japan's surrender. Led by Brigadier General Gregory Bates and supported by logistics officers from the Pacific Supply Command, they designed what became known as the Occupation Feeding Program. Their calculations were staggering. To stabilize Japan, at least 2,000 calories per person per day would be required for 70 million people. American stockpiles alone could not meet that figure, so emergency convoys began sailing from Guam and San Francisco with millions of rations: powdered milk, canned meat, flour, and vitamins. Quartermaster Logistics Report, Aug. 1945. But this effort wasn't just about calories. It was psychological warfare with a humanitarian face. American intelligence officers had studied Japan's wartime propaganda, which painted Allied soldiers as barbarians. By feeding those same civilians, MacArthur's staff hoped to dismantle that image in weeks rather than years. "We will conquer their fear with food," wrote Colonel William Siebold, a senior aide in the Supreme Command. SCAP Psychological Operations File, Sept. 1945. The technical side of this operation was as vast as any battle plan. Every tin of rations came from an intricate supply line stretching across the Pacific. Factories in Chicago, Kansas City, and Detroit ran day and night to produce C rations and K rations designed for tropical combat, but now repurposed for civilian survival. Engineers from General Foods and Hormel modified canning processes to extend shelf life beyond 2 years. Powdered milk was produced in Wisconsin, using vacuum dryers first developed for the U.S. Navy's submarine fleet. Technical Manual TM 9294. 1943. Each soldier's ration pack was a miniature feat of engineering: a main meal tin, a high-calorie chocolate bar, vitamin tablets, and soluble coffee. When the war ended, these kits became instruments of reconstruction. The food that once fueled amphibious assaults now rebuilt trust in burned-out neighborhoods. In an ironic twist, the same rations that had marched across Saipan and Iwo Jima now crossed the streets of Tokyo and Osaka, this time unarmed. On the ground, the logistics challenge was immense. The U.S. 8th Army managed depots holding over 150,000 tons of food. Japanese railway engineers, once serving the Imperial Army, were conscripted to restore lines destroyed by bombing, so trains could deliver supplies inland. Every night, long convoys of Studebaker trucks rolled from Yokohama's port toward Nagano, each carrying precious cargo under armed guard. U.S. Army Transport Command Log, Nov 1945. Still, the operation faced resistance, not from the Japanese, but from American troops themselves. Some soldiers questioned why their former enemies were being fed, while Europe still struggled with shortages. Others, haunted by wartime losses, saw the program as betrayal. To counter this, occupation leaders organized briefings and screenings of short films showing malnourished Japanese children. The message was clear: feeding Japan wasn't charity, it was insurance against chaos. Psychological Services Division Memo, Dec 1945. As supplies expanded, engineers from the Public Health and Welfare section began constructing community kitchens, known locally as Kyushoku centers. These facilities used surplus army stoves and field pots to feed thousands daily. Japanese women, trained by American nutrition officers, learned to mix ration powders with local ingredients like rice bran and sweet potato. The result was crude but life-saving. It wasn't American food or Japanese food, it was survival food, recalled one worker decades later. Osaka Welfare Archive, 1972. Then came the turning point, the winter of 1946. Tokyo was blanketed in snow, and reports indicated famine in northern Honshu. Trains were buried, ports frozen, and warehouses nearly empty. MacArthur's staff debated rationing U.S. soldiers to free up supplies for civilians. Against military advice, MacArthur ordered additional shipments from Hawaii, declaring, "The enemy of democracy is hunger." SCAP Directive No. 92, Jan 1946. Those emergency shipments saved tens of thousands. Civilians called the convoys food angels. The Japanese press, once muzzled by censorship, began cautiously publishing stories of American compassion. But compassion alone didn't win hearts. It was consistency. Soldiers who shared their meals every day built relationships that outlasted orders. In one rural village outside Sendai, a group of U.S. engineers stationed to repair bridges began feeding children daily from their mess tent. Over time, they taught local carpenters to build ovens from scrap metal. The engineers' ingenuity and generosity earned them a nickname: the Bridge Builders of Bread. Field Engineering Unit Report, Mar 1946. The deeper mechanics of these interactions reveal how technology and humanity intertwined. The U.S. Army's field refrigeration units, designed by engineers at General Electric, allowed meat and dairy products to survive Japan's humid climate. Without those mobile coolers, the relief effort would have collapsed within weeks. Likewise, portable radio systems, manufactured by Motorola, coordinated supply drops across hundreds of miles. The airwaves, once filled with battle commands, now carried messages like "Children fed," 1400 hours, "Village secured," Bureau of Supply Communications log, 46. Yet the strategy had a darker edge. By providing food, the United States controlled Japan's most vital dependency. Political analysts within the occupation openly described it as a benevolent monopoly. Japan's economy, shattered by war and dependent on imported grain, became tethered to American shipments. MacArthur's advisors knew that a population dependent on the U.S. for survival was unlikely to resist political reform. State Department Policy Memo, APR 1946. Still, among the rank-and-file troops, few thought in those terms. To them, the daily ritual of sharing food felt deeply human. Many wrote in their diaries of how the act changed them. One soldier from the 27th Infantry Division recorded, "When you've fought a man and then feed his child, something in you breaks, and maybe that's what makes peace possible." Private Journal. June 1946. By summer 1946, the policy had transformed Japan's urban landscape. Cafes reopened, powered by surplus field generators. Farmers began trading with U.S. supply depots for fertilizer and tools. And while resentment lingered among some veterans, the majority of civilians came to see the occupation troops not as conquerors, but as strange, uniformed guardians of their fragile new world. Tokyo Reconstruction Bureau Report, OG 1946. The hidden advantage behind those shared rations was more than logistics or goodwill. It was the deliberate merging of compassion and control. America's engineers and soldiers had mastered the art of winning through nourishment. In every steaming bowl of soup, in every ration tin passed from one trembling hand to another, a message was embedded. The new order would not come from violence, but from sustenance. Yet as Japan rebuilt, a question began to echo within both nations. How long could mercy sustain obedience? The war of bombs had ended, but a new kind of war, one of influence, dependency, and ideology, was only beginning. By 1947, the rations that had once fallen from soldiers' hands became the backbone of a vast reconstruction machine. What began as compassion evolved into policy, and what began as survival evolved into allegiance. Japan's people, once taught to hate the American flag, now looked to it for their next meal. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey 1947. Food became the first currency of peace. In Tokyo's markets, cans bearing English words, spam, klim, corned beef, became symbols of prosperity. Housewives learned to barter them for cloth, firewood, or soap. Children traded chocolates for pencils. The black market, once dominated by desperation, slowly transformed into the skeleton of a consumer economy. American rations had done more than feed the hungry. They had introduced a taste of the New World to a defeated empire. Tokyo Market Analysis Report, Jan 1947. At the center of this transformation stood General Douglas MacArthur, whose headquarters in the Daiichi building overlooked the imperial palace. He understood that feeding Japan meant shaping its soul. His policies aimed not just to prevent rebellion, but to realign the nation's moral compass. Under his orders, schools began serving lunches made from American supplies: powdered milk, wheat flour, dried eggs. "Nutrition is democracy," one of his aides famously remarked. SCAP Educational Bulletin, Feb 1947. Psychologists working under the U.S. Civil Information and Education section tracked how children's attitudes toward American soldiers shifted. Surveys showed a remarkable change. Fear turned to admiration, and admiration turned to imitation. "The children now salute our men on sight," wrote one officer. They wave the stars and stripes cut from ration boxes. Psychological Evaluation Unit Memo, MAR 1947. But the impact of these meals went far beyond propaganda. They rebuilt trust, fiber by fiber, calorie by calorie. Each can of rations replaced the hollow ache of hunger with the slow pulse of hope. A young Japanese teacher from Yokosuka described it best. "When my students drank American milk, it was as if light entered their eyes again." Yokosuka teachers. Diary 1947. Behind the scenes, thousands of American engineers, farmers, and factory workers unknowingly powered this quiet revolution. Grain elevators in Kansas shipped wheat to Yokohama. Dairy plants in Oregon dehydrated milk for Japanese schools. Cargo crews at Pearl Harbor packed containers day and night. Their labor stitched together an empire of logistics more powerful than any fleet. U.S. Agricultural Export Division Report 1947. In factories rebuilt under occupation supervision, Japanese workers learned to repair and reproduce American machines. The same discipline that had once built Zero fighters now produced tractors and food processors. Engineers from both nations collaborated to redesign rice mills, increasing output by 40%. Industrial peace through nourishment, one American economist called it. Allied Industrial Reconstruction Report, 1948. The transformation was not purely altruistic. Feeding Japan had become a geopolitical weapon. In Washington, officials realized that a stable, well-fed Japan could serve as a bulwark against communism in Asia. The humanitarian mission merged seamlessly with Cold War strategy. U.S. cargo. Ships still bore the markings of the Red Cross, but their payloads carried the invisible ink of policy. State Department Brief, 1948. Meanwhile, on the ground, soldiers continued their quiet work. Many of them, long after being rotated home, could not forget the faces of those they had fed. Some sent packages back to families they'd met. Others sponsored children through post-war relief agencies. Decades later, interviews would reveal that these acts changed the men more than the war itself. "We went to Japan as conquerors," said one veteran, "but we left as witnesses to what kindness can do." Oral History, 1975. For the Japanese, the legacy was equally profound. Hunger had stripped away pride, but the food restored something deeper, a sense of connection to the wider world. It bridged the silence between victor and vanquished. When American rations finally ceased in 1952, many wept. The end of aid felt like the end of a friendship. Yet the lessons endured: discipline, modernization, and resilience. From the ruins of famine rose a generation determined to rebuild with their own hands. Post-Occupation Social Study, 1953. By the early 1950s, Japan's cities pulsed with new energy. Neon lights replaced blackout curtains. Factories hummed with production. Markets overflowed with goods. But at the heart of that rebirth lay the memory of those first meals, the taste of chocolate, the smell of tinned ham, the sight of an American soldier smiling through the smoke of ruin. Yokohama Reconstruction Journal, 1950. The soldiers had not known it then, but their simple acts of generosity had altered the trajectory of a nation. They had dismantled hatred with the one weapon that never jammed: compassion. And in doing so, they proved a truth that generals and politicians had rarely admitted, that victory is not measured in cities taken, but in lives restored. Psychologists analyzing post-war Japanese morale noted that gratitude toward the American occupation became a cornerstone of Japan's later alliance with the West. In trade, diplomacy, and defense, the echoes of those early rations persisted. "Food built faith," wrote one sociologist, "and faith built the future." Institute of Pacific Relations Study, 1954. Even decades later, when Japan rose to become an economic powerhouse, the memory of those shared rations lingered. In small villages, elderly survivors still kept the rusted lids of American cans as keepsakes. Some were used as toys, others as altar offerings, a tribute to a kindness born from devastation. The moral weight of the story endures. The American. Soldiers who once fed their former enemies never sought monuments or medals. Their legacy lies instead in every full stomach, every rebuilt school, every handshake across the Pacific. What began as an act of mercy became the blueprint for reconstruction around the world, from Korea to Germany to Iraq. Post-war humanitarian, Analysis 2003. In the end, it was not the atom bomb that secured Japan's future, nor the treaties signed in distant rooms. It was a soldier's hand extending a can of food to a trembling child. That image, muddy, quiet, human, became the seed of a new world order. As one American veteran reflected half a century later, standing on the same street where he once handed out chocolate bars, "We thought we were feeding them. But really, we were feeding the idea that people can be better than war." Dramatized composite quote, based on Oral Histories, 1995. And so, from the ashes of Hiroshima to the ports of Yokohama, from fear to faith, the simple act of sharing rations became the foundation of peace. In modern war, it seems, the most powerful weapon is not firepower, it is empathy. U.S. Strategic Reflection, 1955.